Thank you for joining our conversation today on concrete actions that we think can be taken with your help to respond to climate-induced transnational migration. We have an excellent group of panelists today. Catherine McKenna is former Canadian Minister of Environment and Climate Change and founder of Climate Nature Solutions. Matthew Scott is head of Human Rights and the Environment at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Claire Trottier is acting executive director and board member of the Trottier Family Foundation. Our World Refugee and Migration Council panelists are James Hathaway, who is Dean Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. Victor Law is founder and executive director of Haven. Warda Shahzadi Megan is a partner at Landings, where she practices immigration and refugee law. We will leave ample time for questions after our panelists' discussions. Please use the Q&A button to submit yours. We'll do our best to get to them all. Now, I would like to ask the chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council, Lloyd Axworthy, for some opening remarks. Lloyd, you have the floor.
Thanks, you, Jeff. I only take a few minutes, but I'd like to begin by recounting a conversation I had this morning with friends in my home city of Winnipeg, who were describing the enormous impact that the forest fires are having in northern Manitoba. Not only do we now have an incredible movement of people in the tens of thousands, but we're also facing an increasing sort of health risk by the smoke that's been emitted. What is interesting that the Winnipeg Free Press, which is our good local paper, had what I would call a good example of catch-22 when it comes to climate. But on the one hand, we have these incredible new pressures of more people escaping, moving, being displaced. At the same time that around the world, various governments are cutting back, denying, reducing their impact on controlling emissions. We're really kind of faced with it's a paradox. It's almost a Monty Python show, but it's out in real life because there's people being sorely damaged and hurt. And as a community, international community, what's happening in the prairies of Canada is a small microcosm of what's taking place right across the world. And yet we're again withdrawing any kind of international collaboration and efforts to find solutions to this kind of interchange, this integration of climate and migration that feed each other and are so destructive, as well as unsettling in our security and our stability. I just recall a conversation I had back about 7 or 8 years ago with David Suzuki, who was very much head of the environmental movement. We were at a meeting together at a university, and we started talking about how there were two silos: those who were interested in refugee migration issues and those interested in responding to climate change. And there was two different kind of tracks being followed. And we hoped at the time that eventually those tracks would converge. Well, I think the panel this morning is an example of how that can happen and what it should happen. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I thank the panelists who've joined us for bringing their interest and their commitment to share with so many others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. I'd like to ask Claire Trottier, whose foundation is spearheading the largest commitment to climate in Canadian history, to speak.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Yes, as you mentioned, the Trottier Family Foundation is a leading climate funder in Canada. We recently committed $150 million by 2030 to fight climate change and help galvanize other Canadian philanthropists to join us. We've now reached $480 million of commitment to climate, which is an impressive number and is also not enough. Less than 1% of philanthropic dollars are going to climate change right now. Lloyd described what's happening in Manitoba right now. We've experienced many different climate disasters here in Canada and around the world. And unfortunately, the reality is that these climate disasters are going to increase in intensity, increase in frequency, and have massive repercussions for human life on a planetary scale in ways that are really hard to communicate. And we're doing our best at TFF to try to mitigate the impacts of climate change so that we are on the best scenario possible. Unfortunately, right now, because of some of the political realities, we do see that it is quite concerning that we might be heading towards much more catastrophic levels of warming. But no matter what level of warming we end up with, we are going to be experiencing situations that will result in migration, whether within regions, within countries, and more internationally, as these climate disasters happen. And as food systems, for example, are impacted, that's going to be one of the major outcomes of climate change. Countries whose economies rely on certain forms of food production are going to struggle immensely, and we can foresee lots and lots of downstream repercussions to that unfortunate reality. Here in Canada, speaking as a Canadian, we have contributed to the situation that we're in due to our lifestyles and the way that we produce so much produce so much carbon into the atmosphere. And so I think it's also our responsibility to act and to support communities that are going to be much more deeply impacted. We are currently impacted in Canada. We will continue to be impacted, but it's going to be much more devastating in other places around the world. And the impacts on migration will be substantial and significant. So I'm really encouraged by the conversations that's taking place here today to see that folks are working at the intersection of climate and migration and coming up with concrete solutions to help address this very real crisis that is right at our doorstep. And with that, thank you very much. I'll hand it back to the other panelists.
Thanks, Claire. Warda.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Claire. It's a real privilege today to join the group here to launch the World Refugee Migration Council's 2025 Action Plan. And this plan is the product of many years of hard work by a lot of you in this virtual room, including council members you'll hear from today, but also others who have done a previous iteration of this work, including Rosemary McCartney, Ben Hampson, Alan Rock, and Elizabeth Ferris. So the goal really of this action plan is to take that expertise that's already existed amongst many sectors and to produce not another report, but a very tangible action plan that we'll speak about that focuses on one of the most urgent challenges of our time. And the good news is that we have the tools and the leadership to get started. So we're at this inflection point, and climate change isn't just altering landscapes, as many of you know, it's really displacing people. The cross-border displacement at the moment is no longer a future concern the way it was even 5 years ago. It's already here. So the purpose of the Council's action plan is to bring together this expertise. Again, not to produce another policy brief or an academic paper, but to focus on practical, rights-based next steps as a global community. And so in that vein, the action plan consists of 3 parts. And you'll see that each part focuses on a short-term, medium-term, and long-term timeline. And it also focuses on a domestic, regional, and international level. And all of this is done by design to make sure that we're taking tangible but specific steps in each of these spaces. So I'll start with the first one. It's Pillar 1, and the focus is to have a climate migration pathway pilot that uses existing immigration tools that are already at the disposal of countries around the world. These include things like humanitarian and compassionate programs, as well as public policy measures and private sponsorship, which many of us are familiar with. This isn't theoretical, and the benefit of starting with existing tools is that there's a proof of concept, and the council has done this work before in other spaces, and we can now expand it to the climate migration space. The second pillar of the action plan is regional, and it's medium term. Regional cooperation is key in addressing some of the issues that are already arising, and we have a small window to act as fast as we can to displace the numbers while they remain manageable. You'll hear more about this pillar from Victor as well as Catherine McKenna. The third pillar is long-term, and it's international, and it focuses on the infrastructure that's needed to respond to the new reality. And you'll hear from Jim Hathaway and Matthew Scott, who will outline a potential concept where we're looking at a new protocol under the Statelessness Convention to recognize the reality of climate displaced persons as de facto stateless. Of course, no one should lose their rights just because their country is not livable, and that's what really this action plan pillar takes as its starting point. So you'll hear in turn how the action plan is targeted, sequenced, and grounded in real policy tools that are already at our disposal. And it's designed to build on the existing work that's done by many in this room. And we're focusing on convening the leaders and adding a small part to move these three items forward. I'll start briefly describing the first pillar, and then my colleague Victor Lau will take it over. So the goal of the first pillar, which is the short-term pilot project that focuses on domestic policies that already exist within the immigration space to support climate displaced persons. We have these tools. We've seen other organizations like the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers recommend the use of these tools. And so this isn't about changing laws. It's about using what's already in place. A few quick examples of what we can do is to have policy guidance for officers who are looking at the application of humanitarian and compassionate tools. We've done this before, and we can do it again. And it just requires the stroke of a pen, and it doesn't require any legislative changes. The same thing with creating public policy measures. There are, in many countries, including Canada, ministerial authorities to create special programs. The council has done this before for domestic violence survivors, and it can do it again. And so that's another example of something we can use to get moving right away. And the third example might be our very acclaimed private sponsorship program. And it's a Canadian innovation, but it also now is around the world. And the council wants to build a climate sponsorship framework with partnerships to move this element forward as well. And so as we speak more so in the question and answer session, you'll see that there's a very tangible deliverable for each of these items. And we'll discuss it deeper in question and answer sessions. I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Victor.
Thanks, Warda. So picking up where Warda left off on the first pillar, making a climate migrant pilot happen in Canada, we want to make sure that we're recognizing the political moment that we're in right now, not just in Canada, but around the world. It's a tough moment right now to introduce new pathways for migration, let alone protect existing pathways for migration. One of our focuses within this pilot is to make sure that we don't just have the finish line for the pilot be when these climate migrants land in Canada, but rather when they are resettled and fully integrated into Canada. So this is part of how the pilot would be also something that works for Canada, and if we're able to export this model, work for other hosting nations. Currently, one of the biggest problems in receiving refugees is that after they've been received, it can take years for, in Canada's example, for them to learn English or French, for them to find meaningful work, for them to become integrated into Canadian society. And so hopefully by having not only a focus on creating pathways, but also making sure that these pathways work for climate migrants and for Canada and other hosting countries, this can become a very practical and more politically saleable, politically acceptable solution that we can use to actually make progress in launching this pilot. Unfortunately, we know that the scalability of this pilot and of these types of programs would be limited. And so this is the transition from the first pillar to the second. Over time, we know that the climate crisis will be displacing more people. Eventually, this crisis will go from a crisis that is mostly focused on internal displacement to then climate migrants leaving their home countries and going to neighboring countries in the same region. And so it becomes a regional crisis. We need regional solutions. And so those regional solutions basically break down into two parts, at least the way that we're thinking about it. The first part of the regional solution would be the political and legal frameworks that govern climate mobility. Currently, regional frameworks for mobility exist around the world. Not all of them mention climate, and the ones that do are in various stages of development. So probably the best examples for climate mobility frameworks are coming out of Asia Pacific, looking at the Pacific Island nations, and some parts of Africa. Those need to be developed so that the political and legal framework for letting people move from their home country to neighboring countries actually works. The second part of making regional solutions happen, though, comes down to resources. And by resources, I mean funding. We need the money to actually support the nations receiving climate migrants to make sure that they're being properly served. For this funding, the place that we look at is the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, or the Loss and Damage Fund. Very quickly, for those who are not familiar, the Loss and Damage Fund was created through the UN COP process. It's in its early days of implementation now. I believe as of April 2025, the Loss and Damage Fund is beginning the rollout of small grants to projects addressing different forms of the effects of climate change, helping developing nations mostly deal with those negative effects. And an important thing to note about this Loss and Damage Fund, and this makes me think of what Claire said about an impressive number that's not enough. Currently, we have about $700 million that has been pledged to the Loss and Damage Fund. About $300 million has been actually received by the Loss and Damage Fund. This is nowhere near the amount of funding that will be needed to properly address, let alone climate migration, but the full effects of climate change. And so there needs to be development there. But if we think about, let's assume that the regional mechanisms, the regional frameworks move forward. Let's assume that the funding through the Loss and Damage Fund moves forward. The big question that the council will be addressing in the work that comes next is how should the Loss and Damage Fund interact with this myriad of regional climate frameworks to make sure that climate migrants are served around the world. That breaks down to a lot of difficult questions that we can get into in the Q&A. It's difficult to find experts on this topic, but fortunately, we do have an expert with us on the call here. Catherine, do you mind if I pull you in here?
I'm happy to join.
It's a difficult question to pose to you because it can get very big very quick, but do you mind just sharing some of your thoughts about the current state of cooperation on climate finance and on climate migration?
Sure. It's great to join everyone. And this is a really excellent group. And to Lloyd's point at the beginning, I think that we really have to stop working in silos. And the climate world is very good at doing this: climate and nature, climate and finance, climate and migration. So there are many different examples. So kudos to the group. Look, it is still extremely fragmented when it comes to the international community in the COP process or the broader climate world when it comes to migration and refugee issues. I mean, in COP21 and in the Paris Agreement, there is mention of climate migration. That was actually quite hard fought. But just having language in the Paris Agreement is certainly not enough. I would, to Victor's point, I mean, the getting the loss and damage fund was also extremely hard fought, but the problem is the way it's structured, in terms of both the quantum we're talking about, but the distribution and the politicization of it. I think it makes it's a challenging vehicle. I mean, hopefully it can be made more effective, but it's going to need a lot more money. And I think it's going to have to be a lot, and it covers a lot more than climate migration. So to be fair, but the challenge is how do you actually, take this fund and make it practical in a way that's going to address the actual real challenge of climate migration and climate refugees. And I think, I mean, look, you can even see the problems in Canada. Canada does not make, I mean, we talk about it a bit at the national level. I mean, right now we have, once again, 30,000 people. Lloyd talked about this, 30,000 people that are internally displaced in our own country as a result of the climate crisis, many of them in remote communities. I spent 18 years of my life in a place called Baker's Narrows outside of Flin Flon. It almost burned down, but the cottages all around it burned down. And Puckatuag and the community, the Indigenous community out there, they're still having problems evacuating everyone. So this is a massive problem for Canada that we haven't even grappled in the Canadian context, let alone when it comes to refugees. And then what role Canada should be playing as a wealthy country who cares about climate change, who also cares about inequality and fairness and development, what we should be doing. So I think, I mean, having said that, out of every crisis is an opportunity, and sadly, climate is now in our face. It's not something that is a long-term thing. I think that there is an opportunity for a group like this with a serious work plan to really focus on what we need. Sometimes you need to invent new things. So as I say, the loss and damage fund, we will see. It just does not have enough money, and I'm not sure. I mean, hopefully, we're going to be, there are a lot of players that are trying to figure out that fund. So that on the migration side, that will be one focus, but there are many other areas. I mean, there are other conventions. There's other bodies or mechanisms. There's the Task Force on Displacement, which was under the Warsaw International Development Mechanism for Loss and Damage. It provides some guidance in terms of migration policy and planning, so getting away from the money part, which is a very important piece. And then, I mean, I think there are other measures like the Green Climate Fund. Actually, I was trying to figure out what else we have in the international toolbox on climate. It has finance mechanisms, and it's focused now on adaptation and resilience building that may indirectly reduce forced migration. Because let's also be clear, we can't assume that any of these people want to move. So when I was at COP21 and we had small island states, I mean, there was a lot of compelling comments by folks that were talking about how they don't want to move, that actually this is also related to, actually meeting our commitment under the Paris Agreement to limiting warming to 1.5, which many people have given up on. I certainly haven't given up on it, and we can't give up on it, but it's, that actually is also related to this. So just a comment in terms of framing, we do need to be slightly careful because I know that there are sensitivities, especially with small island states, when people sort of assume that people will have to leave their homeland. No one wants to leave their homeland. Go talk to Inuit. Do they want to leave their homeland? I was reading an article in the Globe. Indigenous peoples, this is the first time many of them are leaving their communities. They are forced to leave their communities. They weren't looking for this. So I think just always, it is important to always be sensitive. But I think also like linking this to legal human rights and advocacy, I think is extremely important. And I think that the IOM is very well placed, but I think this group too. And so, I mean, there's a lot more to say. And I must say, this hasn't been my focus. So I had to kind of like step back and really think about it. It's not something, that isn't important and that I don't recognize as a really big issue, but in a way, in the climate world, everyone's kind of dealing with really mitigating emissions. Adaptation is kind of the poor brother of mitigation, but then we have to get to the migration, the refugee issue. And so I think this comprehensive approach is really needed. And I think the good news or bad news is we have clear examples right now. So people can't say this is a future issue. This is actually a real issue too, right here, right now. And that should mean that the Canadian government also has to pay attention, although I am still, like probably many others, trying to understand what the new bill is that just came out yesterday. and what it means to refugees and asylum claimants generally, as opposed to like in a more specific case where we already don't have real protections or a process.
So thank you, Catherine. I'm going to introduce our third pillar, which actually follows very neatly from where Catherine just was. I mean, it's true in the refugee world, no refugee ever wants to leave her home. That's just a truism. But as we've seen, as countries continue to not make their climate change target and goals, people are moving internally, people are increasingly moving regionally. And in the Council's view, it's important that we begin planning for the prospect of global movement as well. We, of course, hope it isn't necessary, but it would be foolhardy not to forward plan. So we are committed to broadening the international protection pathway for victims of climate change. I want to be clear that we're not starting from square one. First of all, regional treaties, particularly in Africa and Latin America, already grant refugee status to people at risk due to broadly based events disturbing public order, which climate change sadly may cause. But secondly, and at the global level, the UN Refugee Convention already protects many people forced to move due to climate change, in particular where discrimination infects the response to displacement. So for example, if whites are relocated while blacks are not, if the homes of political allies are rebuilt, but those of disfranchised minorities are not, those disfranchised groups are already entitled to refugee status under the UN's Refugee Convention. And a third critical pillar is that if the risk actually amounts to a threat to life or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, even if there is no discrimination, there is also already a global pathway to protection under the UN's Civil and Political Covenant. So who does that leave out, is the question. And that's where we want to focus. Clearly, some climate migrants will not be moving within one of the regions that has a broader protection scheme. And quite frankly, and in any event, it's in our view unethical to dump all the responsibility of these by and large poorer regions of the world. Many climate migrants will also not be able to show the discrimination that refugee law requires, nor demonstrate a risk that satisfies the demanding, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment threshold that international human rights law requires. Let me give you a couple of examples. Imagine somebody forced to flee because climate change has taken away their livelihood, or because they have no reliable access to food, as Claire mentioned in her initial comments, or because there are no longer any operational schools for their children. The World Refugee and Migration Council believes that such persons, like all involuntary migrants, deserve access not just to charity, which is the dominant approach right now, but to a rights-based protection regime that is predicated not on leaving all of the responsibility on the immediately impacted regions, but predicated on global shared responsibility. These involuntary migrants, we think, can rightly say that their home country has been rendered uninhabitable by climate change. So the Council has proposed exploring the possibility of a protocol to the UN's Statelessness Treaty, which now covers only people who are formally stateless, that would actually add de facto statelessness as a protected category. That would grant globally guaranteed rights, not just charity, to all persons unable to remain in their home country because of the ravages of climate change. So I'll invite Professor Scott to share a few thoughts on this possible approach.
Great, thanks, James, and thanks for having me here. Just to put my contribution in context, I want to say that I've been working on legal responses to both internal and cross-border displacement in the context of disasters and climate change for about 15 years. And I currently lead the work of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in this area on research, education, and international technical cooperation across Asia Pacific, Africa, and Europe. So I'm very familiar with what's going on in this space. And when I was invited to engage with this initiative, I was inspired because it's doing a lot of the things that I think ought to be happening in this space. And what I mean by that is I think that this initiative picks up where other initiatives actually leave off. So because it's expressly focused on interregional displacement, and this is significant. So if we go back to 2011, which is when I think the international attention really shifted to this phenomenon of climate-related mobility. What we've seen since then is an elevation of the issue dramatically on the international agenda. But in practice, as we heard from Victor, a lot of the attention has really been limited to developing regional mechanisms. So this is really promising, and we want to see how these develop in Africa, in the Pacific, in the Americas. But really, it's been kind of disappointing to see the limited progress, both in terms of understanding the dynamics of inter-regional mobility. That means Africa to Europe, or South America to North America, Canada, etc. We really haven't developed much understanding of the empirical dynamics as well as the legal responses. So this staged approach that the council is proposing, I think, is really spot on. And so when we get to the point that James has been introducing in terms of the statelessness convention, I want to zero in on that because I think here we have an innovative legal response that helps, I think, to move away from the securitization narrative that's attached to the concept of climate refugees. And I think this is what's critical in this space, because right now, when we're thinking interregionally, in contrast to within regional mobilities, it's really a question of deterrence trumping cooperation. So we have this notion of the deterrence paradigm where we have a fortress Europe, for instance. And I think as the impacts of climate change exacerbate, we can expect this kind of fortress mentality to really be amplified with serious catastrophic consequences for people trying to enter places of safety, but also that kind of authoritarianism that's associated with militarized border control will only increase. And that's a terrifying reality for people outside the borders as well as within the borders. And so when we move to this idea of a statelessness convention, focusing on de facto statelessness as an innovation to an existing international instrument, I want to just emphasize quickly 3 points that I think this offers in this space. And the first is that it leverages existing international legal instruments, whilst at the same time as a protocol promoting innovation. It's also, as I said, free from the securitized discourse of climate refugees. And it would also provide this internationally recognized status and, as James said, associated rights for people whose states are no longer able to provide the minimum protections associated with citizenship. And finally, as an international agreement, a protocol on the Statelessness Convention will take time. And this is a good thing. If work begins now, there's time to prioritize learning more about interregional climate displacement to ensure that the ultimate text addresses actual rather than imagined gaps in international protection. That's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And I want to also thank not just you, Matt, but also Claire and Catherine for having joined forces with the WRMC members today. And in a moment, we will be inviting questions and comments from all participants with Stoub moderating. I want to pause here before we go there because this is not just the launch of a report, but today is also an invitation. It's an invitation to everyone who has joined us and all of your colleagues and friends who may be interested to join us on this journey. As I hope you can see, the World Refugee and Migration Council is committed to taking practical action that draws strength from the research and analysis that many of you participating in this webinar have already done. But we're not going to be able to move this forward without you. So if you are willing to put your shoulder to the wheel with us, we really invite you to join a working group under one of the 3 pillars of action that we've introduced briefly today. So if you're interested, for example, in the first pillar, in pushing for test pilots to expand domestic humanitarian regimes to provide options for the climate displaced. Or if you're interested in the second pillar, you see the value of our medium-term project of getting the fund for responding to loss and damage and other mechanisms to take climate migration more seriously and specifically to fund intra-regional responses. Or if you're interested in the third pillar, our longer-term push to get international law to protect not just refugees and persons facing cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, but also de facto stateless people who can no longer live with dignity in their home country. If any of these 3 themes engages your interest, then we need you. So as this webinar ends, each of you who've registered for the webinar will be receiving a follow-up email invitation from the WRMC to be part of one of our climate migration working groups, each of which will be chaired by 2 or 3 WRMC members. We'll then reach out to you and get you as involved as you are able and willing to be. We really beg you to complete the little, very simple questionnaire quickly so that we can move the ball forward. And we're super grateful for all of you having taken the time to be here this morning. And I'll now pass the baton to Jeff, who will moderate our Q&A session.
Thank you, James. In fact, there's a question that came up for you. Maybe you could jump in right away on that and expand a little bit on the questions around the Statelessness Convention. The question, though, is about the Convention on Refugees and how it relates. What role does a UN-wide effort play at updating the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees in adding the legal concept of an environmental refugee?
Yeah, and the short answer is we think that's a bad idea. We think it's a bad idea for a couple of reasons. One is this is a really, really difficult moment for the Refugee Convention. It is vulnerable in the extreme, and yet it is the world's most effective human rights mechanism. So we don't want to open the Refugee Convention because we know that if we open it for one purpose, we open it for all purposes. You can't stop what states will do. And the Council, based on its experience, understands that that's likely to move protection for most refugees in a negative direction. But secondly, and equally important, as I tried to explain in the introduction, it is a fallacy that the Refugee Convention does not already speak to climate migrants. It does. There are court decisions from numerous countries. Professor Scott has a database that is marvelous and tracks these developments that has shown how the Refugee Convention, at least where the response to involuntary movement has been discrimination, which again, tragically, it usually is. Like, one racial group gets moved, one political group gets helped, the other one doesn't. These are already classic convention refugees. So we do not need to open the Refugee Convention in order for them to be protected as refugees. So for those 2 reasons, we think it's much better to move, and conceptually, people fleeing climate migration, the residual group I talked about, aren't people at risk of being persecuted because of who they are or what they believe. They're people who've lost their homes. There are people who can't stay where they are. And conceptually, they are therefore much more akin to stateless people than they are to the classic refugees. So I hope that gives you some sense of our answer at least.
Thank you, James. Perhaps I'll pass this one to Warda, and I'll bring you up here. We can have a bit of a conversation on this. A nice note about praising the proactive response, and I appreciate the work vision and sorry, my screen is moving here, and innovation on the project. The question is about whether or not we'll be engaging youth, elders, women, Indigenous people to come up with protocols and solutions. They're the most closely impacted and need to be at the center and co-design and leadership.
Yes, we've had discussions about that already, led by Lloyd, and so we will absolutely be engaging in targeted reach outs to get that input and feedback incorporated into the first stage of the pilots. Yes, that's an excellent point.
Very good. I'll just jump to another question here from Jean Massot. While the action plan focuses understandably on response and coordination once displacement occurs, should we not also give greater attention to prevention, including disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, to reduce the need for forced displacement in the first place? How can funding and regional mechanisms better support resilience building efforts in climate vulnerable communities before migration becomes a necessity?
Look, maybe I can quickly respond to this, and it's a really important point. I think one of the dilemmas with climate change is that there are so many pieces that it's really easy for us to be effectively unable to act because it seems so big as to be unmanageable. As a World Refugee and Migration Council, we thought that what we ought to do is to contribute within the areas of our expertise and competence, and that is transnational migration. This takes nothing away from the critical importance of the scientific, political, economic, and other innovations that ought to be happening right now to stop the problem. But our job as a council, we believe, is to prepare for the likely prospect that even if everything works as planned, as hoped, and quite frankly, we're not on target to do that, even if we do manage to put the brakes on, a lot of people in the interim are going to need homes. And it's our job and our responsibility to bite off a piece of the puzzle, not to be the universal problem solver. We're not competent to be that, but to bite off a piece of the dilemma, taking account of the whole, but not trying to reinvent the whole, and do something real and manageable that we believe is within our wheelhouse.
Thanks, James. Victor, did you want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, exactly. Seconding Jim's point, I think the purpose of this project is to be very disciplined with the scope of what we can bite off. And even if we're able to make progress on migration alone and leaving climate adaptation and resilience to others, that would already be a massive, massive project. I will say one interesting thing. When you delve into this work, there's some very interesting overlaps between, for example, climate adaptation and climate migration. So I'll give a specific example. Usually we think of climate migration as a reactive step. You can also think of it as a proactive step. And then suddenly there's a clear connection with climate adaptation. And linking this to funds, when we think about how expensive is it to resettle a climate migrant, it is significantly cheaper to resettle them before the climate disaster strikes. And so the proactive route for resettling a climate migrant is far more resource efficient than the reactive post-disaster route of resettling someone then. And so again, we're going to be strict with the scope of our project, but there are very interesting ways in which climate adaptation and climate migration actually overlap a bit.
Thanks, Victor. There's a question here from Rachel Bryce. She's interested in hearing more regarding the political challenges within regional free movement agreements and how implementation can be ensured in regions impacted by overlapping hazards, for example, climate and conflict. I don't know which one of you would like to answer that. Perhaps Lloyd could weigh in on that as well after. Yes.
Oh, I can, I'm certainly not the expert on this at all, but I think if I understand the question correctly, it's that there are a lot of other obstacles to implementation and effective action. And I think this goes back to the point that Jim and Victor are making, which is that we are going to chew off bite-sized pieces. We're going to focus on small regions and make incremental, take incremental steps. And so you're right in that there are a lot of overlapping conflicts that prohibit regions from focusing or acting or create other incentives. And that would be something that we want to look at closely, especially if under Pillar 2, those are the regions that we're focusing on.
Thanks, Warda. Lloyd, did you want to jump in on that?
Yes. Jeff, I want to bring I guess, a perspective which I would
Lloyd, we just lost you for a second there.
okay.
Go
Am I
ahead.
back? I don't know how this. Okay.
Yes. Go
All
ahead.
right. Well, let's begin with one of the realities that the major climate action is becoming hooked with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in terms of generating a major sort of disruption of security and stability in the world. You can go back to Syria, where the drought in northwestern Syria caused a major migration to Aleppo, which then became the hotbed for the new Arab efforts, which resulted in millions of people literally being massacred by the government because they didn't respond. You have the situation today in Sudan, where one of the major sources of the genocide that's going on there is the fact that it's a fight between the farmers and the nomads, and the Janjaweed are in control, and they just are extinguishing anybody who is in the class. I think we can go to a variety of examples, and I'm reminded that when way back when I was working on setting up the Commission on Intervention and Sovereignty, and we were looking at the responsibly protect idea, it was that whole concept immediately really began with the UN looking at the question of what are the rights of people who no longer have any kind of political connection. They're denied the apparatus to be able to express or have responses to their actions. So I guess what I'm saying on the political question, I think there's a way of turning it around. I think if, as part of the sort of expression of why this is important, we have to not only point to the incredible impact of people themselves and on the region of displacement, but it's also become a major sort of pressure and force in terms of generating conflicts, mass exterminations, sort of major issues of exclusion of people. And therefore, I think it becomes part of that, what I consider kind of the top tier of international existential issues. And I don't want to complicate, but we're talking about how do we intertwine climate and migration. I think we now have to talk about climate migration and security as being very crucial to the world that we're living in, and that being able to bring a human rights base to that is really, I think, crucial and clear. The kind of role that I think our own country should be expressing, because it's going to take some leadership to get that discussion going. It may
Thank
also
you,
change the
Lloyd.
politics in our own country, which is now focused on security because Donald Trump keeps raising it. Well, this may provide an opening to start dealing with the impact of the climate-based migration and what it's going to do in terms of both in our own region but internationally, affecting our own security as the world becomes ever more sort of not only fragmented but out of control.
Thank you, Lloyd. Ask Matthew to join the conversation here.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and other speakers, and for the questions. I was going to respond to that one about conflict and regional mechanisms with reference to this IGAD protocol. The IGAD region in East Africa includes heavily conflict-affected countries, including Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, and Uganda. And in 2018, or thereabouts, this regional mechanism adopted a protocol on free movement, which includes specific provision for receiving people who are displaced across borders in the context of climate change. So this is a major innovation by countries that are really feeling the brunt of the climate emergency right now, but it's early days. So we have to see how these mechanisms work. And I think I wanted to use that example to segue to that broader question about what we do with a new protocol on statelessness, for instance, because when I started working in this space, there was a lot of talk about a protocol to the Refugee Convention or some kind of transformation there, and there was appropriate hesitation. A lot of what Jim has already referenced to, appropriate hesitation, because to a large extent, we still have a limited understanding of the dynamics of especially inter-regional movement, but also intra-regional, and how the law and the realities of people on the ground intersect. What are the gaps and what are the challenges for people to actually move and secure a life with dignity in new places? There's been a lot of work on it, but not at this interregional level. And so that's why when I concluded my intervention, I wanted to emphasize the benefits of starting early and trying to understand what is happening at this interregional level. Jim mentioned the climate mobility case database that I'm working on together with the Global Strategic Litigation Council and Earth Refuge. Specifically to try to do that. So how are existing mechanisms working, and how then can we fill gaps through the kind of measures that are proposed by the council? So a big call for understanding the realities at the different levels of this super complex problem.
Warda, you had your hand up there.
Yes, I just wanted to add, and we certainly didn't have time to get into this in our opening interventions, but this is a big part of the first pillar, of which we want to start these processes, pilot programs. You'll see one of the deliverables is to gather data from access to information requests to see what the patterns are. And if we don't have that, it's really hard to design effective mechanisms to respond. And so that's something that's very front and center for us as a short-term goal.
Excellent. James, a question came in again about the point is there are already many people migrating due to climate change and impact on their livelihoods, but the links is sometimes very difficult to demonstrate. How do we make the definition of climate refugees more inclusive but also politically acceptable?
Well, again, I think the starting point is not to reinvent the wheel, right? So we already have regional refugee regimes in Latin America and Africa that are capable of embracing precisely those groups without any change. Secondly, the Refugee Convention, if there is discrimination in the response or the impact of climate change, already provides protection. And the third mechanism that I briefly alluded to, a huge innovation in the last decade, all of the countries to the Civil and Political Covenant, which is 3/4 of the world's countries, are obliged not to return any climate migrant who faces the risk of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, even absent discrimination in their country of origin. So I don't want us to feel powerless. We've got these three critical kinds of legal mechanism already in place. Again, as Matthew has, I think, insisted, the project for the remaining group is a long-term project. It's not going to be done tomorrow. And quite frankly, it is less urgent than those that are addressed by the first three. The first three are the critical imperative. I am being discriminated against because I am Black. I cannot get housing. Those people are already entitled to move and to gain rights in a country of asylum. So I'm not a big fan of trying to come up with a climate migrant definition. I think that's not helpful. I think what we do is we take each piece by piece by piece. The piece that's missing, I think, are those who face serious forms of risk in terms of livelihood, access to food, water, schooling, and otherwise in a non-discriminatory context. And those are the people that a protocol to the Statelessness Convention could easily address as de facto stateless. And that's why we've focused on the one remaining piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, James. A PhD candidate is asking to better support local adaptation. What are the ongoing efforts to understand how other factors and significant social processes exacerbated by climate change can contribute to this movement in fragile and vulnerable contexts? Throw that to the group.
I can take this one.
Thanks.
I think it's really interesting. There's a bit of information asymmetry here. So I think about it like this. Imagine there's 4 levels of players. There's the local, there's the national, there's the regional, then there's the international. Who understands the unique problems of migrants in their area the best? The local level. Who has the money? The international level. And so there's a big issue with information going up and down those levels and making sure that the people, the organizations who are on the ground are able to get the funding to make the solutions that they uniquely need happen. And so that addresses not only these migrants who are displaced by climate, but displaced by other factors. And so what this looks like practically is that right now there's some conversation between the international level. So take, for example, the Loss and Damage Fund, and the regional level, some of these regional bodies that should be accessing funds from the Loss and Damage Fund. But we need to make sure that below that, the national level, countries are coming together and being heard within the regional level. And then below the national level, that individual local actors are being heard by the their national organizations, and that the solutions needed are being pulled up and are being funded by the international funds available.
Thanks, Victor. We just have a few minutes left here. There are a couple questions that maybe speak to next steps a bit. Just one question relates to the database that Matthew, you mentioned for tracking legal protection of those displaced in the context of climate. And if that's accessible, maybe we could share that link with people. And then just questions about, the next steps on the working group. How will this be done, and what kind of participatory action research projects with climate-affected communities might we be able to put together as part of this?
But I think the answer to the latter is we don't know yet. And we don't want to dictate that. That's not our job as a council. Our council responsibility we felt was to lead and to provide an opportunity and a forum. So the invitation you'll be getting in a few minutes will ask you which of the three groups you might be interested in joining and what your time availability and expertise is. We're then going to convene each of those groups and let the group work through the action plan rather than dictating a plan to the members of the group. So this is a participatory opportunity. It's not simply buying into something that's written in stone. It's helping us to actually frame the next steps in the action plan. And we really sincerely hope that not only you, but all of your colleagues and friends that may not have been able to be here today, please reach out to them and let them know that we need them. And the more intelligent, committed, thoughtful minds we have working on this, the greater the likelihood that we're going to be able to achieve something real.
Excellent, thank you. We might have time for one other question here. It's a bit long, but how does the council understand, how does our group understand climate mobilities abroad in relation to climate mobilities at home? Wildfires, floods, and storms have displaced hundreds of thousands of people. What are the policy levers for climate adaptation and emergency preparation? We've addressed that to some extent in our earlier conversations. Did anyone else want to perhaps weigh in on that before we sign off?
Maybe just as a quick closing thought, sorry, Jim, and restating some of what Jim and I said before. It should be not discouraging to say, let's focus on one bit of this big problem. It should be really encouraging. I think the reason why a lot of us, all of us, not to speak for the council, but why we chose to get involved with this is because we wanted to actually make something happen. And the only way to make it happen is by saying, okay, you can divide this crisis into several component parts. Let's take one. Migration is already big enough. And so climate adaptation, unfortunately, out of scope for us now. But the good news is that there's other organizations that are better equipped, better suited to take that challenge on.
Excellent. One last one here on internal displacement to follow up on that. Do you think the UN guiding principles on internal displacement should be amended as well to adapt to the evolving context of displacement?
Look, Matthew might disagree with me on this one. Honestly, I don't think we need more normative work on internal displacement. Controversially, I took the view that we didn't need it in the first place because internal migrants are internal human rights victims, and there's nothing in the guiding principles that wasn't already in the covenants, just contextualized. So don't create more work for lawyers and political scientists. Let's get down to brass tacks. I think the norms are there. What's needed is the action. And that is precisely why the World Refugee and Migration Council calls this not a study, but an action plan. This is about doing something, even if imperfectly, even if partially, even if incrementally. It is time for the rubber to hit the road and for all of us to try as best we can to make something real happen rather than just producing another study or another set of norms.
Thanks, James. I think we'll leave it there. Appreciate everyone's questions and all of our panelists. I think it was an excellent discussion. We look forward to receiving additional questions or links or information from all of you. As we move forward, we'll be providing you updates as well as that survey, which we look forward to seeing your responses on how you can get involved in our work here. Thank you to all.